Carl Jung and his encounter with Buddhist philosophy. In 1939, in a quiet room in Zurich, Switzerland, Carl Jung, one of the greatest Western psychologists, sat deeply immersed in profound thoughts, flipping through classical Eastern philosophy books. Jung, a pioneer of modern psychological theories, had spent his life exploring and explaining the mysteries of the human mind. However, at a pivotal moment, he encountered an Eastern philosophy that would radically change his perspective on the self and human existence: the Buddhist doctrine of non-self. This doctrine asserts that the self, the very concept Jung had spent much of his career studying to understand how each individual perceives and defines themselves, might be nothing but an illusion, a psychological structure created by humans. This idea was in stark contrast to the theories Jung had developed up until that point, where the self played a central role in understanding human psychology. This discovery not only shocked Jung, a Western scientist who valued logic and empirical theory, but also caused him to reconsider his own hypotheses. Yet, instead of dismissing this philosophy, Jung found it genuinely compelling and valuable. He referred to Buddhism as the most rational and direct religion. What drew a psychologist who had spent years researching the self to an ideology that seemed to oppose everything he had worked on? The answer lies in what Jung found in the intersection between Western psychology and Eastern philosophy. For Jung, Buddhism was not just a religion or a spiritual philosophy, but a system of thought that helped explain the deep and complex aspects of the human mind. While the West emphasizes defining the self and affirming the existence of the I, Buddhism focuses on the realization that attachment to the self is an illusion, and liberation is found in the renunciation of the I. Jung realized that by understanding Buddhism deeply, we could become more aware of the layers of illusion within our minds and thus expand our capacity for self-awareness and self-healing. The Buddhist philosophy, with its concepts of impermanence and the constant change of life, offered Jung an entirely new perspective on consciousness and the unconscious. He not only saw parallels between Buddhist ideas and his own theories about the shadow, but also felt a connection between liberating the mind from illusions and the self-healing potential inherent in each individual. Indeed, Carl Jung saw that Buddhist thought could complement his own theories of analytical psychology. When exploring the darker and unconscious aspects of the human psyche, he recognized a correlation with the Buddhist concept of the shadow, where each person must confront and accept the hidden, darker elements within themselves. The approach to these aspects is not to defeat them, but to integrate and understand their nature. This process, Jung believed, is the path to liberation and spiritual freedom. The blending of Western psychology and Buddhist philosophy helped Jung broaden his perspective, not only in his studies of human nature, but also in seeking harmony between reason and spirit, the self and liberation. He no longer viewed the self as the center of existence, but as an inseparable part of a larger system, an invisible connection between humans and the universe. Today, the ideas Jung shared about the relationship between psychology and Buddhism continue to inspire those seeking balance between reason and emotion, between the I and the whole. They help us realize that the self is not always the most important thing. Rather, spiritual freedom and the awareness of non-self are the keys to peace and enlightenment. Jung and the ego, profound discoveries and the connection to Buddhist philosophy. Carl Jung, one of the greatest psychologists of the 20th century, renowned for his theories on the collective unconscious and archetypes, dedicated his life to exploring the deepest structures of the human mind. One of the core concepts in Jung's theory is the ego, which he saw as the center of consciousness and psychological wholeness. For Jung, the ego was not just the conscious I we identify with in our daily lives, but the point of intersection between the conscious and unconscious mind, where different parts of the psyche come together to form a sense of self. In his theory, Jung distinguished between the ego and the unconscious, arguing that the unconscious contains the shadow and archetypes, universal psychological patterns that exist in the collective unconscious. However, as Jung continued his research into the human psyche, he realized that his discoveries bore striking similarities to Eastern philosophies, particularly Buddhism. This similarity opened up a new path for him to explore consciousness and the unconscious, leading to profound reflections on the ego, not just as the I, but as a question of existence and the illusion of the self. Throughout the 20th century, ancient Buddhist texts, especially the teachings of the Buddha on Anatta, non-self, began to be translated into English and German, offering a fresh perspective on consciousness and suffering. The doctrine of non-self is central to Buddhism, asserting that the ego, which we perceive as reality, is an illusion, and the I is merely a temporary aggregation of physical and mental elements. According to Buddhism, the five aggregates, form, sensation, perception, mental formations, and consciousness, are transient and constantly changing. When we cling to the ego, it is the source of suffering because this attachment creates the illusion of a permanent and unchanging self. This raised a significant question for Jung. Does the I that we perceive and cling to truly exist, or is it simply a mental construct created by the interaction of temporary elements in the human mind? While the ego in Jung's theory is central to consciousness and plays a crucial role in maintaining psychological integrity, when compared with the Buddhist teaching of non-self, Jung began to question whether the ego is truly an independent, solid entity or just the result of unconscious forces at work in the mind. This exploration led to a significant shift in Jung's thinking about the ego. Instead of viewing the ego as a stable entity, Jung began to see it as part of an ongoing process of change and development. He realized that, like the Buddhist philosophy of non-self, the ego might be an illusion, a temporary image that arises in the flow of consciousness, and that clinging to it is the root cause of suffering and anxiety. For Jung, this parallel was not the end but the beginning of a deeper understanding of humanity. He did not dismiss the ego. Instead, he saw it as part of a larger psychological process where individuals must confront the dark aspects of their minds, the shadow, to achieve integration and a deeper self-awareness. Jung believed that the path to psychological maturity was not to deny the ego, but to understand it, how it forms and influences behavior and emotions. While Buddhism encourages renouncing and freeing oneself from the ego to attain enlightenment, Jung believed that this process was not about abolishing the ego but about integrating and working with it. He argued that rather than rejecting the ego, individuals need to recognize and work with their unconscious aspects to develop holistically, achieving harmony between consciousness and the unconscious, between the self and the non-self. Thus, the intersection of Jung's psychology and Buddhist philosophy helped him develop a more profound and comprehensive view of the ego. Jung sought not only to understand the structure of the psyche, but also to expand his vision beyond the confines of the West, adopting a more holistic approach to the human condition, suffering, and liberation. For Jung, the ego was not a fixed entity but part of a psychological development process where self-awareness and harmony between elements of the psyche were key to achieving wholeness and inner peace. Buddhism and Jung's perspective, profound insights into the ego and self-awareness. While Carl Jung viewed the ego as the center of psychological wholeness and an essential bridge for deep self-awareness, Buddhism offers an entirely different perspective. According to the Buddhist teachings, there is no fixed self, and the ego is merely a collection of transient phenomena, always changing and without inherent existence. This is not just an abstract philosophical idea but a truth that can be directly experienced through meditation and personal practice. The absence of a fixed self is the foundation of the doctrine of Anatta, non-self, one of the core principles of Buddhism, and provides profound insight into how the human mind operates. Jung, as a Western scientist, devoted much of his career to studying complex psychological structures. While he believed in his theories of the ego and the unconscious, he could not ignore the striking similarities between his psychological framework and Buddhist teachings. He observed that, although Buddhism denies the existence of a fixed self, there was a significant overlap in how both philosophies address suffering and self-awareness. Jung believed that suffering, ranging from anxiety and depression to a sense of aimlessness in life, stems from clinging to a fixed ego, an I we believe is permanent and unchanging. This creates a mental tension because this ego cannot fully control the continuous changes in life. Buddhism's view of the ego as non-fixed reflects a vastly different perspective from the Western understanding of the self. In Buddhism, the ego is simply a collection of impermanent elements, the body, emotions, thoughts, and ever-changing consciousness. Awareness of the self is one way in which humans experience the world, but it is not an independent, enduring entity. These concepts can be directly experienced through meditation, where practitioners observe the constant change in their mind and sensations without becoming attached to them. Through this, one can realize that everything, including the ego, is without inherent existence. While Jung agreed that the ego could be a temporary construct, he believed that the ego plays a crucial role in maintaining psychological stability and harmony. The ego is what helps people recognize themselves in this world, and through it, we interact with society and fulfill essential life functions. However, Jung also recognized that clinging to the ego, when people resist its natural impermanence, leads to suffering. For this reason, in his psychological analysis, Jung not only focused on clarifying the ego but also sought to resolve unconscious conflicts so that individuals could achieve inner harmony and overcome mental blockages. Both Buddhism and Jung point out that clinging to a fixed ego, whether physical or mental, leads to suffering. However, while Buddhism calls for the abandonment of the self and the pursuit of liberation through meditation and non-self-awareness, Jung believed that self-awareness and integrating the dark aspects of the mind were the paths to psychological maturity and freedom. Jung did not deny the impermanence of the ego, but he emphasized that confronting and accepting the unconscious elements of the ego, those parts we often reject or hide, was essential for holistic and healthy development. A noteworthy distinction is that, while Buddhism encourages detachment from the ego to attain enlightenment, Jung saw understanding the ego not as a process of renunciation, but as a continuous confrontation and integration of the darker aspects of the mind. This is clearly reflected in his concept of the shadow, where Jung believed that individuals need to face and accept the underdeveloped or imperfect parts of themselves rather than deny them. Only then can the ego develop comprehensively and harmoniously with the unconscious, helping individuals achieve deeper self-awareness and overcome psychological suffering. From a Western perspective, Jung can be seen as someone who developed his own path to understanding and confronting the ego, not to eliminate it, but to work with it in a healthy and constructive manner. He believed that psychological maturity arises from a clear awareness of the ego's impermanence, not from renouncing it. Buddhism, on the other hand, seeks liberation through the complete renunciation of the ego, aiming to reach enlightenment and escape suffering. Both perspectives offer value in helping individuals face suffering and achieve inner peace, but they come from different approaches, reflecting distinct cultural and philosophical foundations. The intersection of two philosophies, Western psychology and Buddhist philosophy. The encounter between Carl Jung's Western psychology and Buddhist philosophy is not just a cultural intersection, but also a fascinating clash of two distinct views on the nature of humanity. While Jung devoted his life to exploring the depths of the psyche, seeking ways to reconcile inner conflicts, the Buddha taught how to overcome attachment to the ego and see through the non-self nature of all phenomena. At first glance, these two perspectives might seem contradictory, but a deeper look reveals how they complement each other in ways that are not immediately obvious. Jung, as a Western psychologist, developed his theories based on the belief that the ego is the center of the mind and consciousness. He believed that individuals need to develop a clear awareness of themselves, confront the unconscious aspects of their psyche, and integrate them to achieve psychological wholeness. Jung's goal was not to deny the ego, but to help individuals develop a strong, balanced ego that can effectively deal with life's challenges and foster personal growth. However, according to Jung, the development of the ego is not a fixed process but a continuous journey of self-awareness and integration of the shadow aspects of the self. He argued that this was the only way humans could achieve true freedom. In contrast, Buddhist philosophy denies the existence of a fixed self. The Buddha taught that the ego is merely a collection of impermanent phenomena, without inherent existence, and that attachment to this ego is the root of all suffering. Buddhism holds that humans must let go of attachment to the self to reach enlightenment, transcending the suffering they create through misconceptions about the ego. Buddhism does not aim to reinforce the ego, but to dissolve it in order to reach enlightenment, where everything is seen as non-self and impermanent. Surprisingly, instead of contradicting each other, these two perspectives seem to naturally complement each other. Jung recognized that confronting the paradox between ego and non-ego opened up new depths in the journey of self-discovery. While Buddhism guides people to let go of the ego and recognize all phenomena as impermanent, Jung asserted that the ego, though not fixed, can still be understood and integrated into a larger whole of the mind. Jung did not deny the non-self. Instead, he believed that humans need a strong ego to facilitate the integration of both conscious and unconscious parts of the psyche. This ego is not a fixed entity, but a continuous integration of both the light and dark aspects of the mind. This intersection is truly fascinating because it sparks a dialogue between two cultures, Eastern and Western. The West, with its scientific and analytical foundation, has developed theories like Jung's to better understand the human mind. Meanwhile, the East, through Buddhist philosophy, has found ways to help people liberate themselves from the suffering caused by attachment to the ego. But rather than standing in opposition, these two views can be combined to offer a more profound understanding of human nature and may hold the key to finding true peace in life. One key element in this intersection is the understanding of suffering. Jung recognized that while the ego helps people exist and interact with the external world, excessive attachment to this ego leads to internal conflicts and suffering. Buddhism also points out that attachment to the ego is not only the source of suffering, but also one of the greatest obstacles on the path to enlightenment. However, Buddhism goes further by teaching that liberation comes not only from recognizing suffering, but also from letting go of the ego and reaching enlightenment, a state completely free from attachment and bondage. While Buddhism encourages detachment from the ego, Jung believed that self-awareness and integrating unconscious aspects of the psyche are the paths to personal growth and psychological freedom. Jung believed that one cannot simply abandon the ego but must confront and integrate the shadow aspects of oneself. By doing so, individuals can achieve wholeness and maturity. This view contrasts with Buddhism but can harmonize with Buddhist thought when considering the ego not as a fixed entity but as part of a continuous, evolving process. In summary, the intersection between Jung's Western psychology and Buddhist philosophy is not a contradiction but a dialogue between two profound views of human nature. Although they come from different cultural and philosophical backgrounds, both aim to help individuals overcome suffering, achieve deeper self-awareness, and find inner peace. By combining these two perspectives, individuals can explore a rich path of spiritual development, which is both scientific and contemplative, helping them face themselves more fully and live a harmonious, meaningful life. Jung's theory, from ego to wholeness. Carl Jung, one of the greatest psychologists of the 20th century, developed a profound theory about the human mind. He described the ego as the center of consciousness, where people become aware of themselves and interact with the world around them. However, according to Jung, the ego is just the tip of the iceberg, and beneath its surface lies more complex structures that people are often unaware of. These layers include the personal unconscious and, deeper still, the collective unconscious, two crucial elements in his theory. In Jung's framework, the personal unconscious contains all the memories, emotions, and experiences that have been forgotten or repressed throughout an individual's life. This is the space that holds parts of the self that one cannot or does not want to face, but which still exert a powerful influence on behavior and emotions. The personal unconscious can be accessed through methods like dream analysis, free association, and other tools that Jung developed. Beneath this lies the collective unconscious, a groundbreaking concept introduced by Jung. It holds the shared images and memories of humanity, the archetypes that have accumulated over thousands of years of human development. This layer of consciousness, according to Jung, connects all people together, creating common experiences, emotions, and behaviors, even across different cultures. For example, archetypal images like the hero, the mother, or the shadow are all present in the collective unconscious of humankind. These archetypes influence not only dreams but also shape human actions and thought, even when individuals are not consciously aware of them. The process of individuation, according to Jung, is the critical path to achieving psychological wholeness. It is the process by which an individual confronts and integrates the unconscious aspects of themselves, including those parts they have rejected or ignored. The shadow, or shadow self, is a particularly important archetype in this process. It represents the aspects of the self that we are unwilling to accept or are afraid of, such as anger, guilt, or desire. These parts are not inherently bad. They are simply repressed and unacknowledged by the conscious mind. Jung believed that if the shadow is not integrated, an individual cannot achieve wholeness or full psychological development. Rejection of the shadow creates inner conflict and hinders progress in life. From a psychological perspective, the process of individuation is a difficult and lengthy journey that requires people to face their darkest parts and accept them as part of who they are. However, when successful, this process brings harmony and personal maturity. Jung described someone who has achieved wholeness as not only being aware of themselves, but also aware of their connection to the unconscious aspects shared by all of humanity. It is a liberating and creative process, enabling people to live a fuller, more meaningful life. The connection between Jung's theory and Buddhist philosophy, particularly regarding confronting the shadow and achieving enlightenment, is striking. In Buddhism, individuals are also encouraged to face suffering, delusions, and illusions of the ego in order to reach enlightenment. Confronting suffering and the impermanence of life helps practitioners let go of attachment to the self, recognizing that everything is non-self. While Jung did not follow Buddhism, he also believed that confronting and integrating unconscious parts of the self, including the shadow, was a vital aspect of the journey toward wholeness. Both systems of thought believe that self-awareness and the integration of parts of the mind lead to psychological freedom, allowing individuals to live fully and understand their true nature. However, the difference between Jung and Buddhism lies in the fact that while Buddhism emphasizes the renunciation of the ego, Jung stresses its integration. For Jung, the ego is the center of consciousness. It is the self that must be recognized and understood in order to achieve wholeness. In contrast, Buddhism encourages practitioners to transcend the ego to attain enlightenment, where everything is non-self and individuals can experience the invisible connection between all beings. In conclusion, Jung's theory of the ego and the process of individuation offers a deep insight into psychological development and wholeness. This process involves not only self-awareness, but also the integration of rejected parts of the psyche, including the shadow and unconscious archetypes. The parallels with Buddhist philosophy further enhance the value of this theory, as both aim to help individuals break free from the constraints of the ego to achieve freedom and inner peace. Buddhism and Jung's journey. Buddhism, especially through the doctrine of non-self, offers a profoundly different perspective on the ego and human existence. According to the Buddha, the ego is merely an illusion, a product of transient and constantly changing elements, known as the five aggregates: form, sensation, perception, mental formations, and consciousness. These elements interact and form the sense of self, but in reality, they lack any permanent essence and there is no fixed I. The sense of ego is a combination of impermanent factors, and it is the attachment to these elements that causes suffering, as humans constantly seek stability in things that are inherently changing. In his journey of exploring psychology, Jung approached the issue of the ego from a different angle. He did not merely view the ego as a simple structure of consciousness, but also delved into deeper layers of the mind, particularly the personal unconscious and the collective unconscious. Through analyzing dreams and unconscious states of his patients, Jung discovered that symbols like the mandala, an image representing wholeness and harmony in the mind, naturally and universally appeared, even in individuals who had no exposure to Buddhism or Eastern cultures. This reinforced Jung's belief that there is an underlying connection between the human psyche and a larger network. This is the collective unconscious, which Jung described as a reservoir of archetypes, images, and shared experiences of all humanity. The appearance of the mandala in his patients' dreams, even when they had no knowledge of Buddhism, served as evidence that human consciousness is not an isolated unit but a part of a larger system, much like Buddhism's description of dependent origination, the interconnectedness of all phenomena in the universe. In Buddhism, dependent origination is a fundamental concept, which holds that all things and phenomena do not exist independently but are interrelated through causes and conditions. An entity only arises and exists when the necessary conditions and factors are present. This is similar to Jung's view of the collective unconscious and archetypes, where he believed that latent parts of the human mind are not separate but reflections of universal principles and patterns shared by humanity. Symbols like the mandala could be seen as dependent origination of the mind, images inherently present in the collective unconscious, which arise when the human mind needs them to seek harmony and wholeness. Jung also noticed that these symbols are not only personal but also universal, much like the archetypes in the collective unconscious. For example, the mandala symbolizes wholeness and the connection between different parts of the psyche, and its reappearance in dreams may signal that the individuation process is taking place, a journey towards harmony between the individual mind and the collective unconscious. This can be seen as a direct reflection of the pursuit of completeness and enlightenment in Buddhism, where individuals must transcend ego attachment and recognize the interconnection between all things. The connection between Jung's discoveries and Buddhism becomes even clearer when Jung recognized that the individuation process, confronting and integrating the shadow, the unconscious parts of the self, shares a profound similarity with the path to enlightenment in Buddhism. In both cases, the goal is to help individuals transcend the limitations created by the ego to realize their true nature and the nature of the universe. Both Jung and Buddhism emphasize the necessity of facing the darker parts of oneself and the world in order to achieve freedom and enlightenment. Ultimately, Jung's journey was not just a pure psychological exploration but a quest for connection between the individual and the whole, between the self and non-self, between the transient and the eternal. The meeting of Western psychology and Buddhism has created a vast space for understanding humanity, the nature of suffering and freedom, and how individuals can transcend the limitations of the ego to achieve psychological and spiritual wholeness. Throughout his journey, Jung was not just a scientist but also a seeker of truth, much like a Buddhist practitioner. In this process, he touched on timeless truths that Buddhism had addressed thousands of years before, that the ego is an illusion, and only the awareness of interconnectedness and non-self can bring true freedom and inner peace. Conclusion: Carl Jung, as a great psychologist, not only expanded the boundaries of Western psychology, but also sparked a revolution in how we perceive the nature of humanity. He built an intellectual bridge between the East and the West, helping us better understand the depths of psychology through its connection to Eastern philosophy, particularly Buddhism. Jung's interest in this philosophy enriched his theory and provided us with a more holistic view of ourselves and the issues we face in life, particularly suffering and liberation. One of the key discoveries in Buddhist teachings that Jung explored is the concept of Anatta, non-self. This is one of the three marks of all phenomena, alongside impermanence, anicca, and suffering, dukkha. According to this doctrine, what we call the self is actually just a temporary combination of five elements, known as the five aggregates: form, matter, sensation, perception, mental formations, and consciousness. These elements are constantly changing, and none of them exist independently or permanently. Therefore, there is no fixed or eternal self. The Buddha emphasized that the misconception of a permanent self is the root of all suffering, as it leads to attachment, fear, and actions that lack freedom. This view is quite different from Western perspectives, where the ego is often seen as a core component of consciousness and personal identity. In the development of his theory, Jung found intersections between Buddhist principles and Western psychology. He recognized that suffering from anxiety, depression, to a sense of directionlessness often stems from attachment to a fixed and unchanging ego. Buddhism's concept of anatta offers an explanation for liberation from this suffering. The doctrine of non-self is not just an abstract philosophical argument, but also a practical method for freeing individuals from the bonds of illusion. By recognizing that the self is merely an illusion created by impermanent elements, people can release their attachment and achieve inner freedom and genuine peace. A key concept in Buddhism, dependent origination, explains that all phenomena arise due to dependence on other conditions. Nothing exists independently or in isolation. Everything is interconnected and interdependent. What we call the ego is also just a collection of temporary factors, sustained by the ongoing interaction between body and mind. Recognizing that the self does not have a fixed essence can help people break free from negative thoughts, fears, and misguided self-assessments. While Buddhism helps us understand the non-self nature of humanity, Jung provides a method for confronting those parts of the mind that are repressed or hidden, which he referred to as the shadow. Jung's process of individuation, a process of integrating unconscious parts of the self, shares a deep similarity with the path to enlightenment in Buddhism. Both encourage us to face the darker aspects of ourselves and transcend them in order to find wholeness and freedom. When Jung's theory of the ego meets the Buddhist doctrine of non-self, we can see that these are not opposing views but complementary perspectives, opening the door to a deeper exploration of consciousness and the path to enlightenment. Both Jung and Buddhism offer a path to spiritual freedom and liberation from the attachments of the ego. When people realize that the ego is not a fixed entity, they can truly release their fears and suffering and begin to live a life of peace, no longer governed by attachment to a false self. Moreover, these ideas have far-reaching impacts not just in religion but also in philosophy, psychology, and even modern science. Concepts of existence and identity are being re-examined, especially as modern science begins to explore and propose theories about the non-self nature of the universe and the profound interconnectedness between humans and nature. In psychology, non-self has been studied as a means to reduce stress, alleviate anxiety, and improve mental health by helping individuals let go of ego attachment and negative thoughts. Thus, the fusion of Jung's psychological theory and Buddhist teachings not only offers a new perspective on humanity, but also opens up practical methods for overcoming suffering and seeking true freedom. This is a powerful message that resonates with the values of modern society, where people are increasingly confronted with stress, anxiety, and insecurity. When we view the self as an illusion and become aware of our interconnectedness with everything around us, we can live a meaningful and truly free life. Meditation, a key practice in Buddhism, is not only a spiritual activity but has also been scientifically proven to change the structure and function of the brain. Recent studies show that meditation improves connectivity between different brain regions, enhances focus, reduces stress and anxiety, and can even promote positive changes in areas of the brain associated with emotions and cognition. More importantly, meditation helps individuals become more aware of the impermanent and egoless nature of their experiences, enabling them to observe things and phenomena more objectively, free from emotional, mental, and ego-based distortions. When compared to Carl Jung's theory of the ego, Buddhism's concept of no-self may seem like a contradictory viewpoint. Jung believed that the ego is the center of consciousness, the starting point for self-awareness and the journey toward discovering human wholeness. For Jung, the ego is not a fixed entity but a dynamic structure, part of the psychological development process where the conflicting parts of the self are integrated. He viewed the ego as a bridge between the conscious and unconscious, helping individuals understand and work with their inner, hidden elements to achieve psychological integrity. However, Buddhism offers a different perspective on the ego. The Buddha encouraged practitioners to transcend any notion of a permanent self, teaching that attachment to a fixed ego is the root cause of suffering and limits spiritual growth. In Buddhist philosophy, the ego is not central but an illusion, a temporary combination of impermanent factors like the body, sensations, thoughts, and consciousness. Therefore, no self is not merely an abstract philosophical concept but also a practical method, guiding individuals toward ultimate freedom, liberation from attachment to the ego, and the suffering it brings. Although these two viewpoints may seem different, they actually emphasize the same idea. Attachment to a fixed ego is the source of suffering. Jung saw wholeness and integration arising from accepting and harmonizing the conflicting parts of the ego, while the Buddha pointed out that it is the attachment to the ego, a self that does not truly exist, that causes suffering. Both perspectives aim to free the individual from the constraints of the mind, though each has its own approach and methodology. Jung viewed the ego as an essential part of personal development, the point at which individuals become aware of themselves and the world around them. However, he also recognized that if individuals only focus on developing the ego without becoming aware of their dark and undeveloped aspects, the shadow, they will never achieve true wholeness. Jung's process of individuation involves confronting the shadow and integrating these unconscious parts of the self, bringing harmony between opposites. In contrast, Buddhism goes beyond merely confronting the ego. It encourages practitioners to transcend it, recognizing that everything is impermanent and that no fixed self exists. Only by transcending the ego can one attain true freedom and liberation. The combination of Buddhist philosophy's no-self and Jung's theory of the ego can be seen as complementary rather than opposing. Both lead to a common goal: liberation from the constraints of the mind. Buddhism, through the practice of meditation, helps individuals realize the impermanence of phenomena and relinquish attachment to a fixed self, leading to peace and freedom. Jung, while not denying the ego, encourages us to work with the ego, understand the unconscious parts, and integrate them into a flexible and evolving self. Buddhism's teaching of no self, with its profound philosophical depth and practical application, has transcended the boundaries of time and space, becoming one of the most revolutionary ideas in human history. By combining Jung's psychological theories with Buddhist philosophy, we not only gain a fresh perspective on human nature, but also have the opportunity to apply Buddhist practices to overcome suffering and attain true freedom. In today's modern society, where individuals increasingly face stress, anxiety, and inner conflict, the teachings of Jung and Buddhism provide a valuable path toward living a peaceful and liberated life. While Buddhist philosophy offers deep insights into the impermanent and egoless nature of all phenomena, Carl Jung's psychology provides practical tools to explore and address the hidden aspects of the human mind. Jung helps us confront and integrate repressed or concealed parts of ourselves, while Buddhism guides us on how to transcend the limitations of the ego to achieve ultimate freedom. By combining these two approaches, we can discover a holistic path that not only harmonizes with ourselves, but also frees us from the illusions of the self. The complementarity between these two ideologies is not just theoretical but carries profound practical value in everyday life. People frequently face inner conflicts, feelings of anxiety, and attachments to ego-based concepts. Jung's psychology encourages the identification and confrontation of neglected parts of the mind, while Buddhism teaches the art of letting go of attachments to live more freely. For instance, the technique of active imagination in Jungian psychology allows us to communicate with the unconscious through images or symbols, clarifying the root causes of inner conflict. Similarly, Vipassana meditation in Buddhism encourages observing the breath, bodily sensations, and thoughts without judgment, helping one realize the impermanence and egoless nature of all phenomena. By combining these methods, we not only uncover deep aspects of the mind, but also create a space to avoid being swept away by negative emotions or thoughts. The intersection of active imagination and meditation opens up a balanced approach. On one hand, it helps us explore and understand the underlying causes of suffering, and on the other, it teaches us how to let go in order to achieve peace. For example, a person worried about the future may use active imagination to uncover the deep causes of their fear, then employ meditation to observe that fear without judgment, gradually realizing that the fear is just a transient phenomenon, not their true nature. Both Jungian psychology and Buddhist philosophy share a common goal: liberation from the constraints of the mind. Jung refers to this as the process of individuation, where we integrate the unconscious and achieve wholeness. Buddhism calls it enlightenment, the clear awareness of no self and impermanence. Despite using different language and methods, both emphasize that suffering arises from misconceptions, and only by changing our perception of the self can we find true freedom. The combination of Jungian psychology and Buddhist philosophy not only provides profound insights into human nature, but also offers powerful tools to overcome conflict, anxiety, and stress in daily life. The journey to psychological freedom and happiness is not about trying to become someone else, but about letting go of the illusions of self to realize that we have always been whole and complete from within. Who are you when there is no story about yourself? Let this question become the guiding light on your journey of self-discovery, opening up a world where freedom and peace are always ready to welcome you.